Murder at the Synchronized Swimming Championship, narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome to another evening of mysteries, dear listeners. I'm Connor, and you've tuned into Velvet Clues, where we explore the darkest puzzles of human nature through the eyes of Miss Jane Marple. Tonight's tale takes us away from the quiet village of St Mary Mead to the glittering world of competitive synchronized swimming, where beneath the surface of athletic achievement lurks a conspiracy of betrayal, revenge, and ultimately murder. So settle in with your beverage of choice and let us unravel together how a champion coach met her watery end. Get comfortable, because this mystery runs far deeper than any pool. Chapter 1. The Championship and the Curious Coach. The Westbridge Aquatic Centre gleamed with the pristine perfection of a temple dedicated to human excellence, its vast indoor pool reflecting the brilliance of professional lighting rigs that transformed water into liquid crystal. The facility itself was a marvel of modern engineering, constructed only 5 years previously with funding from a combination of local government grants and private donations that had been secured through considerable effort by the sport's dedicated advocates. Miss Jane Marple had come to the National Synchronized Swimming Championships at the invitation of her distant cousin Margaret, who managed the administrative operations for the event, and found herself seated in the observation gallery with a clear view of the competition floor. The morning had been filled with preliminary rounds from younger competitors, their youthful enthusiasm evident in both their movements and their occasional technical failures. Yet it was the afternoon session that promised the real spectacle. The gallery itself was filled with the usual assortment of spectators that such events attracted. Parents of competing swimmers occupied numerous seats, their expressions betraying varying degrees of anxiety and pride. Coaches from various aquatic programs throughout the nation sat in their own designated section, their attention focused with professional intensity on the performances unfolding below. A handful of journalists, along with several photographers equipped with waterproof camera equipment, documented the proceedings for regional newspapers and sporting magazines. It was a respectable crowd, neither as massive as one might find at Olympic trials, nor so sparse as to suggest that synchronized swimming occupied an entirely obscure corner of the athletic world. The senior championship division drew the most attention, and the crowd that had assembled was impressive for a sport that Miss Marple had previously thought of as distinctly niche in its appeal. Yet watching the athletes move through the water with balletic precision, she began to appreciate the extraordinary combination of strength, artistry, and courage required to execute such demanding routines. The swimmers performed at depths of up to 8 feet below the surface, maintaining precise formations while holding their breath, their bodies subjected to considerable pressure and exertion, while their faces maintained the serene expressions demanded by the artistic components of their routines. Coach Elena Vasquez had become something of a legend in the synchronized swimming world over the past 5 years, taking a previously middling regional team and transforming them into national contenders. Her program, which she had named the Vasquez Elite Aquatic Collective, had risen from relative obscurity to dominate the national championships, with a consistency that had earned both admiration and, Miss Marple suspected, considerable envy from coaches whose own programs could not match her results. Her athletes moved with a synchronization so perfect that they seemed almost to share a single consciousness beneath the water's surface, their movements coordinated with a precision that suggested something beyond mere training and suggested instead an almost preternatural connection among the team members. Miss Marple observed Coach Vasquez from her vantage point with the particular attention she had developed over many decades of observing human nature. The coach was a striking woman of perhaps 50 years, with the posture and bearing of someone who had once been an elite athlete herself. Her dark hair was pulled back severely in a style that emphasized the sharp angles of her face, and her expression as she watched her team perform was one of complete concentration. Yet there was something in the rigidity of her manner, a tension in her jaw and shoulders that suggested preoccupations beyond the immediate demands of the competition. Her fingers, which rested on the railing separating the coach's area from the spectator gallery, were white-knuckled with tension, and she scanned the pool area with an intensity that seemed to extend far beyond mere professional interest in her team's performance. Miss Marple's cousin Margaret, who had paused in her administrative rounds to sit briefly beside her, remarked that Vasquez's intensity was legendary within the swimming community. "That woman drives her athletes relentlessly," Margaret observed, her tone suggesting a mixture of admiration and disapproval. "They say she's achieved unprecedented results, but some of the parents have expressed concerns about the level of pressure she places on the young swimmers. There have been rumours of athletes requesting transfers from her programme, though such requests are rarely honoured given her contractual arrangements with families and with the facility itself." As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple noticed several curious elements in the proceedings that served to deepen her initial observations regarding Coach Vasquez's approach to coaching and competitive success. One team in particular, the Riverside Aquatic Club, withdrew from a semi-final heat without explanation, their members appearing unusually unwell as they departed. The swimmers seemed to be moving with difficulty, their coordination compromised in a manner that suggested genuine physical distress rather than mere fatigue. Their coach appeared deeply embarrassed by the withdrawal and made vague references to some form of minor illness affecting multiple team members simultaneously, an explanation that struck Miss Marple as somewhat suspicious in its convenient timing relative to their scheduled competition. Two swimmers from different teams seemed to be experiencing difficulties with their balance, even when standing on dry land, requiring assistance from medical personnel, who appeared surprisingly unsurprised by these developments. One young woman in particular, a swimmer named Patricia who competed for the Metropolitan Aquatic Association, had to be supported by two medical technicians as she attempted to walk from the pool area following her routine. The medical personnel guided her with the practiced efficiency of individuals who had encountered such situations previously, offering water and electrolyte solutions while conducting what appeared to be standard neurological assessments. Miss Marple filed these observations away in that particular section of her mind dedicated to anomalies that might later prove significant. The championship demonstration was scheduled for late afternoon, a ceremonial display meant to showcase the sport's highest achievements and to provide inspiration for younger competitors who hoped to eventually achieve such excellence. Coach Vasquez had arranged for an exhibition routine featuring herself and several of her senior swimmers, a performance that was meant to inspire the younger competitors and demonstrate the artistic heights that dedicated training could achieve. The pool had been specially prepared, the lighting adjusted for optimal visibility through consultation with professional cinematographers, and the crowd had settled into expectant silence as the musicians began the opening strains of Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece that had been selected to emphasize the artistic dimensions of synchronized swimming. Coach Vasquez entered the pool alongside her four championship swimmers, and Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her keen eyes tracking every movement with the careful attention that had served her well in investigations throughout her long life. The routine was executed with extraordinary grace, the athletes moving as a unified body through patterns of breathtaking complexity. The coach remained in the center of the formation, the absolute focus of all attention, her movements precisely mirrored by her competitors in a display of synchronization so perfect that it seemed to transcend the capabilities of human bodies operating independently. They moved through sequences of increasingly elaborate maneuvers, creating shapes that seemed geometrically impossible for human bodies to achieve while maintaining perfect synchronization, their bodies forming pyramids and intricate geometric patterns at depths that required considerable physical endurance and breath control. Then, approximately 3 minutes into the routine, something went visibly and dramatically wrong. Coach Vasquez's movement became erratic, her position in the water suddenly unstable in a manner that was immediately apparent to every observer. Her head bobbed upward with sudden urgency, breaking the fluid grace of the performance in a way that seemed involuntary and uncontrolled. The 4 swimmers around her immediately altered their routine, moving to support her with the practiced responses of athletes accustomed to assisting their coach, but their confusion was apparent to every observer in the gallery. The coach's body convulsed in the water, her limbs flailing in movements that bore no resemblance to the controlled artistry of the demonstration, and within seconds she was sinking rather than swimming, her limbs no longer, responding to conscious control. The medical response was instantaneous and comprehensive. Lifeguards who had been positioned around the pool's perimeter dove into the water without hesitation, extracting Coach Vasquez and immediately beginning resuscitation procedures on the pool deck. The music stopped abruptly, the sudden silence creating a stark contrast to the graceful beauty of moments before. The gathered crowd fell into stunned silence, and Miss Marple observed with her characteristic analytical detachment how the assembled swimmers and coaches reacted to the unfolding crisis. Some showed genuine alarm and distress, their reactions suggesting authentic shock at witnessing what appeared to be a medical emergency. Others displayed expressions that might have been shock, but could equally have been the calculated expression of people witnessing an event they had been anticipating, people who had perhaps known what would occur before the demonstration even began. The medical efforts continued with increasing desperation for nearly 45 minutes, the lifeguards and medical personnel attempting every resuscitation technique at their disposal. Coach Vasquez was declared dead within the hour, drowned despite the immediate intervention of trained professionals and the application of sophisticated emergency medical procedures. The official initial determination, based on the preliminary examination conducted by the on-site medical personnel, was that she had suffered some form of medical crisis, perhaps a heart attack or stroke, that had caused her sudden disorientation and subsequent drowning. The competition was suspended pending investigation, and a pall of genuine distress settled over the aquatic centre, transforming the facility from a place of celebration and achievement into a venue associated with tragedy and loss. It was only later, when Miss Marple was discussing the afternoon's events with her cousin Margaret in the administrative offices, that certain peculiarities began to emerge from the various reports and observations that were being compiled by facility personnel. The pool staff mentioned with some confusion that Coach Vasquez's earpiece, a waterproof device she always wore for underwater communication with her team, had been found with its sealing damaged in a manner that suggested something other than normal wear and tear. The metal casing bore marks that appeared to be intentional rather than accidental, and the sealing mechanism that was designed to protect the interior electronic components had been compromised in a way that would allow water to penetrate the device during underwater use. The medical examiner, conducting a preliminary examination of the deceased coach's body, had noted that the coach's left ear showed signs of recent trauma that extended beyond what one would expect from normal water exposure or the standard wear and tear of athletic training. The tissue around the ear canal appeared to have been deliberately damaged rather than injured through accident or normal physical activity, and the examiner had made specific note of this finding in his preliminary report. And one of the younger swimmers had commented to Margaret with the casual offhandedness of someone not fully understanding the significance of what she was sharing, that she had heard rumours among the various aquatic programs that some teams were using chemical enhancements to improve their athletes' performance, enhancing cardiovascular capacity and endurance in ways that would be extremely difficult to detect through standard testing procedures. However, the young woman couldn't name any specific individuals involved in such practices, and she seemed uncertain whether such rumours represented genuine practices or merely the typical gossip that circulated within any competitive athletic community. Miss Marple settled into the guest room that Margaret had provided for her stay in a small hotel near the aquatic centre, and began to consider what she had observed throughout the day. The synchronized swimming community, for all its grace and artistry, appeared to harbour currents of deception and malice that ran as deep as any she had encountered in St Mary Mead. There was something troublingly complex about the afternoon's tragedy, something that suggested that the forces at work extended far beyond a simple medical emergency or tragic accident. The question that occupied her thoughts as she drifted toward sleep was simple but profound. Had Coach Vasquez drowned due to accident or misfortune, or had she been deliberately sent to her watery grave by someone whose motives were as yet entirely obscure? Chapter 2: Whispers in the Chlorine Air. The day following Coach Vasquez's death brought a police investigation that transformed the Aquatic Centre from a temple of athletic achievement into something more closely resembling an interrogation chamber. The facility, which had been closed to the public following the tragedy, became instead a repository of evidence and a site of intensive scrutiny by law enforcement personnel. Detective Inspector Walsh, a serious-minded woman of approximately 40 years, with the bearing of someone accustomed to investigating crimes most would prefer not to contemplate, arrived on the scene within hours of the death being formally classified as a potential criminal matter rather than a simple accident. She established herself in the administrative offices with an efficiency that suggested long experience managing such investigations, and she began the systematic process of interviewing everyone who had been present at the championship. Inspector Walsh's initial approach was methodical and professional, yet her expressions and questions suggested a skepticism regarding the official drowning determination that had initially been offered by the medical examiner. She interviewed lifeguards, swimmers, coaches, facility staff, and spectators with equal attention to detail, compiling comprehensive statements from each party, and noting with particular interest any inconsistencies or suspicious elements in their accounts of what had transpired. Miss Marple, having been present as an observer and being possessed of a keen mind that had proven useful in previous investigations that had crossed her path over the decades, was approached by Inspector Walsh with the courtesy of a professional acknowledging another's expertise. The inspector, upon learning from her initial interviews that Miss Marple was not merely a casual observer, but rather a woman with a documented history of assisting in criminal investigations, treated her with a degree of respect and deference that suggested she had perhaps been briefed regarding Miss Marple's background and capabilities. The inspector's scepticism regarding the official drowning determination appeared to match Miss Marple's own suspicions, and she proved willing to share her observations with the detective in a quiet corner of the facility's administrative wing. They settled into a small conference room, away from the general activity of the investigation, and Miss Marple began her detailed account of what she had observed throughout the day. I observed several irregular occurrences during the competition preceding the coach's death, Miss Marple explained calmly, her hands folded in her lap, in that gesture of composed attention that so often accompanied her most penetrating observations. Specifically, I noticed that at least 2 swimmers from different teams appeared to be experiencing balance difficulties and disorientation. The Riverside Aquatic Club swimmers who withdrew from the semi-finals demonstrated symptoms that were consistent with more than mere fatigue or minor illness. They were not injured, as far as I could determine from my vantage point, yet they moved as though the very ground beneath them was unstable, as though they could not trust their own sense of equilibrium. Such symptoms are not typical for elite athletes at the peak of physical conditioning, Inspector. Athletic individuals are generally quite confident in their physical capabilities and their ability to maintain balance and spatial orientation. Inspector Walsh made careful notes, her pen moving across the pages of her notebook with practiced efficiency. "You suspect the swimmers were deliberately compromised somehow," she said, forming it as a statement rather than a question. "It had occurred to me as a possibility," Miss Marple replied with characteristic understatement. "Combined with the damage to Coach Vasquez's ear protection, which I understand has been noted by your medical examiner, and the peculiar circumstances under which the coach's death occurred during a demonstration that appeared to be proceeding with complete success, I begin to form a rather troubling picture. The damage to the ear protection, in particular, is most significant. That device is manufactured with considerable attention to durability and protection against damage that might occur during normal training activities. The fact that it showed signs of deliberate compromise rather than accidental wear suggests that someone with knowledge of the equipment's construction deliberately created the damage. Inspector Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "I've been pursuing a similar line of reasoning," she said. "The preliminary examination of the coach's body revealed that her left ear showed signs of trauma that extended beyond what one would expect from simple drowning. There appears to have been deliberate damage to the tissue surrounding the ear canal, damage that would have allowed water to penetrate the inner ear during her underwater performance. The medical examiner theorizes that this penetration and the resulting pressure on the delicate structures of the inner ear would cause severe disorientation. A person experiencing such sudden and extreme disorientation underwater would be unable to maintain spatial awareness or conscious control of their movements. They would essentially be drowning while conscious but neurologically unable to coordinate a response. The investigation into Coach Vasquez's background proceeded over the following days with the systematic thoroughness that serious criminal investigations demanded. Inspector Walsh arranged for the coach's residence to be searched, for her financial records to be examined, and for comprehensive interviews to be conducted with all individuals who had maintained professional or personal relationships with the deceased. What emerged from these inquiries was a picture of considerable complexity regarding Coach Vasquez's methods and her approach to achieving competitive success. The coach had been, it emerged through analysis of her personal documents and supplements found in her residence, not merely a coach, but also an unofficial administrator of chemical enhancements to her own team's swimmers. She had been employing a carefully selected combination of subtle drugs administered through the athletes' training supplements and recovery beverages, substances that would enhance their cardiovascular capacity and endurance, while remaining effectively undetectable through standard testing procedures used in competitive athletic regulation. The substances had been obtained through pharmaceutical sources, and their administration had been meticulously documented in personal journals that Vasquez had maintained in her residence. Furthermore, through investigations into the medical histories of competing swimmers and through interviews with facility staff, it became clear that Vasquez had been deliberately administering lower doses or placebo treatments to competing team swimmers whose training sessions occasionally overlapped with Vasquez's team at the facility. By gaining access to the shared training areas, and by engaging in seemingly innocent conversations with competing athletes regarding their training regimens and recovery strategies, Vasquez had managed to introduce contaminated supplements into the training routines of her competitors. The swimmers from Riverside Aquatic Club who had withdrawn from the semi-finals in apparent distress had been victims of her deliberate sabotage, having been unknowingly exposed to agents that caused disorientation, nausea, and significant deterioration of athletic performance. Vasquez's team had advanced through championship rounds by default, while appearing to earn victories through legitimate competitive superiority and superior training methods. The moral implications of these discoveries generated considerable discussion among the gathered competitors and coaches throughout the aquatic centre and in subsequent media coverage of the investigation. Several swimmers came forward with accounts of unexplained symptoms following training sessions at the aquatic centre when they overlapped with Vasquez's team. Others confessed to having been offered supplements by Vasquez herself, supplements that she had assured them were merely performance enhancers of the completely legal variety developed through her own nutritional research, though their actual composition proved to be considerably more sinister and far more dangerous than had been initially represented to the unsuspecting athletes. Yet the most compelling revelation came through a conversation Miss Marple initiated with one of the facility's senior lifeguards, a woman named Patricia, who had been working at the centre for over a decade and who maintained a comprehensive institutional memory of the swimmers and coaching staff who passed through the facility. During a casual discussion about the tragedy and the investigation's progress, Patricia mentioned that she recalled a swimmer who had washed out of elite competition approximately 2 years previous under circumstances that had struck the lifeguard as unusual. The woman had been a prodigy in her early 20s, a genuinely talented athlete who had been featured in local media as a genuine candidate for international representation and Olympic competition, until inexplicable episodes of severe dizziness had rendered her unable to compete safely or to maintain her training regimen. The swimmer's name had been Sophie Chen, and Patricia expressed genuine surprise when Miss Marple gently suggested that Sophie might have been a victim of Coach Vasquez's chemical sabotage rather than a victim of some natural medical condition. The dizziness that had ended Sophie's career might not have been a medical condition at all, but rather the deliberate result of poisoning administered by a coach, whose team represented direct competition to the athlete's own program, and whose competitive approach apparently extended to the sabotage of any swimmers who threatened her team's dominance. Inspector Walsh was particularly interested when Miss Marple shared this information and her reasoning regarding Sophie Chen. The detective immediately arranged for Sophie Chen to be located and brought in for questioning, initiating a process that would set in motion the final revelations regarding the true nature of the crimes that had been committed at the Aquatic Centre. The young woman who appeared at the facility 2 days after Coach Vasquez's death was a shadow of the vibrant athlete who had once been featured in magazine profiles about the future of synchronized swimming, and who had promised to bring considerable international recognition to her small but dedicated program. She moved with the careful precision of someone afraid of losing her balance, walking slowly and deliberately as though she could not entirely trust her body's ability to maintain equilibrium. Her eyes held the particular pain of an athlete robbed of her livelihood by circumstances entirely beyond her control, and her demeanour suggested someone carrying the weight of profound loss and disappointed potential. Chapter 3. The Ear. Protection Examination. Inspector Walsh had retained Coach Vasquez's ear protection equipment as evidence, carefully documenting it and storing it in a secure facility maintained for the preservation of physical evidence. It was this device that drew Miss Marple's particular and sustained attention as she examined it under the inspector's watchful eye during a meeting convened specifically to review the technical evidence collected during the investigation. The waterproof earpiece was a sophisticated piece of technology manufactured by a Swiss company specializing in underwater communication systems, and it was designed to allow underwater communication between team members and coach while maintaining auditory sensitivity to the music and the movements of other athletes in the water. The sealing that had been deliberately damaged was not a minor component, but rather one of the most critical elements of the device's function. The rubber gasket that protected the interior electronic components and the microphone components from water penetration had been systematically compromised in a manner that suggested considerable knowledge of the equipment's construction and operation. The damage was not random or haphazard, but rather appeared to have been created with precision and deliberate intent. "The damage is not random," Miss Marple observed as she examined the equipment under magnification provided by Inspector Walsh's portable forensic examination kit. "The perforation is of a specific size and position, suggesting careful planning rather than accidental injury. Someone with knowledge of the device's construction would have understood precisely where to damage it to cause maximum disorientation while maintaining the appearance of mere malfunction. The inner ear contains the semicircular canals that provide the body's primary sense of equilibrium and spatial orientation. Water penetrating into the ear canal would create pressure on these delicate structures and would caused severe disorientation that would render an underwater swimmer unable to maintain conscious control of their movements. The Aquatic Centre's equipment manager, when questioned, confirmed that Coach Vasquez had stored her personal equipment in a locker accessible to various staff members and close colleagues. The locker had no particular security beyond a simple combination lock, and multiple individuals would have had opportunities to access it during the days immediately preceding the championship demonstration. The equipment manager, a conscientious individual named Richard, who maintained responsibility for all of the facility's athletic equipment, expressed considerable distress upon being informed that the coach's equipment had been deliberately sabotaged, as this suggested a failure of the facility's security protocols that he had designed and implemented. Richard provided detailed information regarding who had accessed the locker area during the 48 hours preceding the championship demonstration. Several team members had accessed the area for legitimate purposes related to their training regimens. Margaret, Miss Marple's cousin, had accessed the equipment area as part of her administrative responsibilities. Several facility staff members had been in the area conducting routine maintenance, and several individuals whose identities were not immediately known had been observed in the area during the early morning hours when the facility was not officially open to the public. It was while examining the damage more closely under magnification that Miss Marple noticed something particularly revealing that appeared to have escaped the notice of the initial examination conducted by police forensic personnel. The edges of the perforation showed evidence of being created by something with a sharp, precise point, something considerably more precise than the crude implements that might have been used by someone attempting casual damage. The damage was too clean and too precisely executed to have been accidental, yet the marks were too small to suggest an obvious instrument of the sort one might expect to be employed in such sabotage. However, when Miss Marple obtained a sample of the materials Sophie Chen carried in her training bag, which Sophie had brought with her to the Aquatic Centre during her interview with Inspector Walsh, she discovered something most illuminating. Sophie maintained an elaborate grooming kit, as many elite athletes do, containing various items related to the maintenance of her appearance and the care of her athletic equipment. Among its contents was a set of high-quality sewing needles of the sort used for repairing competition costumes that frequently sustain damage during training and competition. One needle in particular, when examined under magnification and compared to the damage on Coach Vasquez's ear protection, matched with remarkable precision. The needle bore microscopic traces of salt water and a barely perceptible staining that suggested it had come into contact with seawater or pool chlorine subsequent to the damage it had caused. Furthermore, chemical analysis of residue found on the needle revealed traces of a substance that proved to be highly consistent with the chemical agents Coach Vasquez had been using to poison her competitors. Sophie had not merely had the opportunity and knowledge to damage the equipment, she had had direct exposure to the poisoning agents through her own experience of being victimized by them. The irony of this discovery was not lost on Miss Marple, who recognized that Sophie's victimization had provided her with the very knowledge necessary to accomplish her revenge. Inspector Walsh received these findings with evident satisfaction, recognizing that they provided compelling forensic evidence of Sophie's culpability in the sabotage of Coach Vasquez's equipment. However, the inspector also recognized that possession of means and opportunity, while circumstantially significant, did not necessarily provide conclusive proof of deliberate action unless corroborated by additional evidence or by confession from the suspect. When presented with this evidence during a formal questioning conducted in a police interrogation room, Sophie Chen finally abandoned her protestations of innocence. Her account of the events leading to Coach Vasquez's death was delivered with the calm acceptance of someone who had long ago made peace with her actions and that had anticipated the inevitable consequences of those actions. She had returned to the Aquatic Centre on the morning of the championship under the pretext of discussing potential remedial coaching with the facility's director, a claim that was verified when the director was subsequently interviewed. Her true purpose had been to access Coach Vasquez's equipment and execute the plan she had been formulating for the previous 18 months, a plan that had consumed her thoughts during the long months of recovery from the poisoning that had destroyed her athletic career. She had studied the ear protection device extensively, obtaining manufacturer specifications and researching the specific damage required to cause complete disorientation when water penetrated the damaged area. She had concluded through her research that creating such damage with a sewing needle would cause minimal external evidence of tampering, and the needle would be unlikely to be identified as the instrument of sabotage unless someone specifically suspected such a method. Sophie had accessed the coach's locker during a period when the facility was temporarily empty due to a staff meeting, moving quickly and deliberately to minimize the risk of detection. She'd used the sewing needle to create the critical perforation in the exact location where it would cause maximum disruption to the coach's equilibrium during underwater performance, then had returned the equipment exactly as she had found it, confident that during the vigorous movements of the championship demonstration, the damage would allow sufficient water penetration to cause the catastrophic loss of equilibrium that would result in drowning. She had calculated that the coach, experienced as she was, would likely attempt to compensate for her loss of equilibrium and would instinctively remain underwater rather than surfacing, a panic response that would prove fatal in her disoriented state. What Sophie had not anticipated, and what Miss Marple gently pointed out to her, was that she had inadvertently created evidence through her own knowledge and exposure to the chemical agents involved. The tiny traces of poison on the needle, transferred from her own contact with the substances during her previous victimization, had provided the crucial link connecting her to the crime. Inspector Walsh, having heard Sophie's full confession, arrested the young woman formally. As the inspector recited the charges and prepared to transport Sophie from the Aquatic Centre, Miss Marple reflected on the terrible circular logic of vengeance, how the victim of one crime had become the perpetrator of another, how the theft of Sophie's career had motivated the deliberate creation of a situation that would result in someone's death. Chapter 4. The Chemistry of Betrayal. The investigation into Coach Vasquez's chemical enhancement scheme revealed a web of corruption that extended far beyond the coach herself. Miss Marple, working in loose collaboration with Inspector Walsh, began to trace the sources of the drugs that Vasquez had been utilizing in her sabotage of competing athletes. The substances had been obtained through a pharmacy located several miles from the Aquatic Centre, an establishment operated by a pharmacist named Gerald Hoffman, who maintained a reputation for flexibility regarding prescription regulations. Further investigation revealed that Hoffman had been receiving substantial payments from Coach Vasquez over a period of approximately 3 years, payments that had been carefully disguised in accounting records as innocent business expenses. Hoffman's motivation appeared to be purely financial. He harboured no particular loyalty to Coach Vasquez and had evidently not concerned himself over much with the purposes to which his illegally supplied substances were being employed. When confronted by Inspector Walsh with evidence of his participation in the conspiracy, he proved remarkably willing to provide comprehensive testimony regarding his dealings with the coach, demonstrating the particular quality of loyalty that such financial arrangements typically inspire. The full extent of Vasquez's enhancement program emerged through the analysis of her detailed personal records, which had been discovered in her residence following her death. The coach had maintained meticulous documentation of which swimmers received which substances, in what dosages and at what intervals. She had tracked the effects of the enhancements through sophisticated performance metrics, noting improvements in her team's competition results with the precision of a scientist conducting controlled experiments. Most damning of all were the entries regarding the competing swimmers she had deliberately poisoned. Vasquez had recorded the symptoms they experienced following exposure to the agents she had administered, had noted with evident satisfaction the deterioration of their competitive performance, and had explicitly stated in her written notes that she viewed such sabotage as a necessary component of maintaining her team's competitive advantage. One entry, dated approximately 2 years previous, concerned Sophie Chen. Vasquez had written with clinical detachment, followed subject 27 during 3 successive training sessions, initial manifestation of dizziness occurring as predicted, recommend increasing exposure through secondary contamination of locker room equipment. Subject will likely withdraw from competition within month if protocol continues as planned. The discovery of these notes transformed the investigation from a straightforward murder case into something considerably more complex. Sophie's actions, while still technically constituting deliberate homicide, appeared to many observers to represent a form of justice rather than a crime. She had taken the life of someone who had deliberately poisoned her, who had engineered the destruction of her career, and who had expressed no remorse for these actions. The prosecutor assigned to the case found himself in a genuinely difficult position regarding how aggressively to pursue the charges. Public opinion, which had initially been shocked by the revelation that Coach Vasquez had engaged in such systematic poisoning of competitors, began to shift towards sympathy for Sophie. Letters to newspapers portrayed the young woman as a victim who had been driven to desperate action by an unscrupulous coach. Inspector Walsh, however, remained unmoved by public sentiment. Her duty was to investigate the facts of the case, not to determine whether the victim had deserved her fate. Vasquez's crimes had been serious and deplorable, but they did not justify vigilante justice. The rule of law required that such matters be adjudicated through proper legal channels, not decided through the personal vengeance of someone with motive and opportunity to commit murder. Chapter 5. The Performance of Truth. As the investigation reached its conclusion, a formal hearing was scheduled to determine the precise charges to be brought against Sophie Chen. The hearing convened in a courtroom that was filled to capacity with observers ranging from fellow swimmers to coaches from various aquatic programs across the region. Miss Marple, having been asked by Inspector Walsh to provide her observations regarding the psychological elements of the case, prepared a comprehensive statement detailing the various motivations and circumstances that had led to Coach Vasquez's death. She presented this statement not as a defense of Sophie's actions, but rather as an explanation of the particular constellation of circumstances that had created the conditions for such tragedy to occur. The court heard evidence regarding Vasquez's systematic poisoning of competitors, regarding the medical consequences that Sophie had suffered as a direct result of this poisoning, and regarding the psychological impact of having an athletic career stolen away through deliberate sabotage. The court also heard evidence regarding Sophie's premeditation and planning in executing the attack on Coach Vasquez, evidence that definitively established that this had not been a crime of passion but rather a calculated act of revenge. What emerged from the testimony was a complete picture of 2 different crimes. Vasquez's poisoning of athletes was a form of assault and sabotage that had caused genuine harm and suffering. Sophie's deliberate destruction of Coach Vasquez's ear protection was a form of premeditated murder designed to cause death through deliberate engineering of circumstances that would produce drowning. Yet beneath the legal technicalities, what remained clear to Miss Marple was a fundamental truth about human nature. Vasquez had been driven by ambition and the desire to win at any cost, had convinced herself that her sabotage was justified by her coaching philosophy and her personal goals. Sophie had been driven by the very justifiable desire to obtain compensation for genuine wrong that had been committed against her, but had chosen to express that desire through violence rather than through legal channels. The judge, after hearing all testimony and considering all evidence, handed down a sentence that represented a compromise between the technical severity of the crime and the circumstances that had prompted it. Sophie was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, a distinction that recognised her actions as deliberate but also acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances that had driven her to such extremes. Chapter 6. The Lifeguard's Observation. Amid the complexities of the primary investigation, certain secondary details began to emerge that suggested there might be additional layers to the conspiracy. Miss Marple, maintaining her characteristic attention to small details that others might overlook, found herself drawn to conversations with Patricia, the senior lifeguard who had initially mentioned Sophie Chen's mysterious withdrawal from competition. Patricia revealed in the course of several conversations that she had observed curious meetings between Coach Vasquez and Gerald Hoffman, the pharmacist who had been supplying her enhancement substances. These meetings had occurred in the parking area adjacent to the Aquatic Centre and had taken place with a frequency and urgency that suggested something beyond mere business transactions. Furthermore, Patricia had noticed that following each of these meetings, Coach Vasquez would retrieve items from her locker that appeared to be carefully wrapped packages that she would subsequently distribute to her team members. The lifeguard had mentioned these observations to facility management on multiple occasions, but her concerns had been dismissed as speculation and gossip. What was particularly revealing, from Miss Marple's perspective, was Patricia's description of Hoffman's demeanour during these meetings. The pharmacist had appeared nervous and apprehensive, as though he were conducting transactions that he fully understood to be improper and potentially dangerous. His behaviour suggested a man acting under coercion or threat, rather than a man engaging in voluntary business arrangements. Miss Marple brought this observation to Inspector Walsh's attention, and it prompted the detective to conduct a more thorough investigation into Hoffman's relationship with Coach Vasquez. What emerged was a somewhat different picture from what had initially been assumed. Hoffman had not been a willing participant in the scheme, but rather a reluctant one. Approximately 4 years previous, Hoffman had experienced a serious personal crisis involving financial difficulties and a gambling addiction. Coach Vasquez, who had discovered this information through her own investigation of the pharmacist, had offered him a simple proposition: provide her with chemical enhancement substances in exchange for payments that would eliminate his financial difficulties. Hoffman had initially refused, but Vasquez had proven to be a woman of considerable persuasive ability. She had made subtle threats regarding the disclosure of his gambling activities to the State Pharmacy Board, had suggested that his professional license could be easily jeopardized if he failed to cooperate, and had generally made it clear that refusal would result in severe personal and professional consequences. Hoffman had capitulated under this pressure and had spent the subsequent years living in constant anxiety regarding his participation in the scheme. He had been unable to refuse Vasquez's demands without risking professional ruin, yet he had harboured significant guilt regarding the impact of the chemicals he was providing on young athletes who had done nothing to deserve the harm that resulted. Chapter 7. Water and Mirrors. As Miss Marple continued her examination of the circumstances surrounding Coach Vasquez's death, she found herself reflecting on the particular nature of the aquatic environment. Water, she mused to Inspector Walsh during one of their collaborative discussions, obscures as much as it reveals. Things that appear clear on the surface often conceal complexities beneath, while things that seem transparent may actually be distorted beyond recognition. The investigation had initially focused on Coach Vasquez as a victim who had become disoriented due to damage to her ear protection. Yet what emerged over time was a more nuanced picture of Vasquez as both victim and perpetrator, as someone who had herself engaged in systematic harm while also becoming the victim of calculated revenge. Inspector Walsh, with whom Miss Marple had developed a productive professional relationship, acknowledged this complexity with visible discomfort. The inspector's duty required her to pursue justice as defined by law, yet she clearly harboured personal sympathies towards Sophie Chen's situation that complicated her professional obligations. What became clear through the investigation was that Coach Vasquez had not merely stumbled into her criminal activities through moral weakness or philosophical disagreement with competitive regulations. Rather, Vasquez had made conscious, deliberate decisions regarding how to achieve competitive success, decisions that had required her to actively harm other human beings in pursuit of her goals. The methods Vasquez had employed, while cloaked in the respectable terminology of sports science and performance enhancement, were fundamentally acts of poisoning directed against athletes who had done nothing to merit such treatment. She had rationalized these acts as necessary components of competitive excellence, had maintained detailed records of the harm she was causing, and had expressed no remorse for her actions. Sophie Chen, by contrast, had engaged in a single act of violence directed against a specific individual who had deliberately poisoned her. The moral complexities of the situation could not simply be resolved through legal technicalities or procedural classifications. Chapter 8. Confession in the Observation Gallery. The formal investigation concluded with a comprehensive review of all evidence and testimony prepared by Inspector Walsh for the judicial proceedings. It was during this final review session, conducted in the observation gallery of the Aquatic Centre, where Coach Vasquez had demonstrated her routine moments before her death, that Sophie Chen made an unexpected request to meet with Miss Marple privately. Inspector Walsh had raised some initial objection to this meeting, suggesting that anything Sophie might wish to communicate should be processed through her legal counsel. However, Miss Marple gently indicated that she believed such a conversation might prove beneficial to Sophie's psychological state, and the inspector relented with the understanding that Miss Marple would file a report regarding any substantive information that emerged from the discussion. The young woman who sat across from Miss Marple in the quiet gallery was a different person from the athlete who had once competed in elite synchronized swimming competitions. Sophie's face bore the weight of her experiences, the loss of her career, the poison that had been administered to her, and now the knowledge that she had deliberately engineered another person's death. She moved, with a careful deliberateness, as though her body had not entirely recovered from the neurological damage that Vasquez's poisoning had inflicted. The observation gallery was nearly empty at this hour, with only a handful of maintenance personnel working in the pool area below. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, creating patterns of illumination and shadow on the bleachers, where spectators would normally gather to watch competitions. It was an appropriate setting for a confession, Miss Marple thought, a place of witnessing transformed into a place of accountability. I want you to understand that I didn't kill Coach Vasquez because of rage or temporary insanity, Sophie said carefully, her voice steady but her eyes haunted. I calculated every detail of what I did. I researched the ear protection equipment for 3 months, studying its design, its vulnerabilities, the precise location where damage would cause the most disorientation without being immediately obvious. I studied how equilibrium loss would affect an experienced swimmer, how the inner ear functions, how water penetration would destroy her ability to maintain spatial orientation. I planned when and how to create the damage, selecting the sewing needle specifically because it would leave minimal evidence. I did everything with complete premeditation, and I'm not going to insult your intelligence or your sense of justice by pretending otherwise. Miss Marple listened without interruption, understanding that Sophie needed to articulate something fundamental about her actions and their implications. The young woman's willingness to acknowledge the deliberate nature of her crime suggested a level of moral maturity that was both impressive and deeply tragic. What happened to me was not fair, Sophie continued, her voice becoming more strained as she spoke. Coach Vasquez deliberately poisoned me. She administered substances to my body without my knowledge or consent. She destroyed my career, my identity, my future as an athlete, and she did it intentionally with full knowledge of what she was doing and what the consequences would be for me. She maintained detailed records of my symptoms, notes expressing satisfaction at my decline. But that doesn't justify what I did. I understand that now. Revenge may feel like justice in the moment, may seem like a legitimate response to grave wrongs, but it's not. It's just another form of violence, perpetuating the cycle rather than breaking it. Sophie paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the armrest of the bleacher seat, as though seeking some physical anchor to the emotional turbulence she was experiencing. The terrible thing is that I was right about all of it, the poison, the sabotage, all of it, and I still chose to respond by poisoning her in return, except I didn't use chemicals. I used her own equipment against her. I became exactly what she was, just in a different form. Miss Marple reflected on this statement, with the thoughtfulness that had characterized her approach to human nature over many decades of observation. "You have demonstrated genuine moral growth through this process," she said gently. "You have recognized that circumstances, however grave, do not ultimately justify the deliberate destruction of human life. That recognition is something that Coach Vasquez apparently never achieved. The coach maintained detailed records of her poisonings, expressed satisfaction at her victim's suffering, and never once questioned whether her actions were morally defensible. You, by contrast, are able to see the moral dimensions of what you have done, are able to acknowledge the harm you have caused, and are willing to accept responsibility for your actions." Sophie nodded slowly, tears beginning to trace paths down her cheeks. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said quietly. "I don't even expect sympathy. But I wanted you to know that I understand what I did, and that I'm prepared to accept the consequences. I've already caused enough harm through my actions. I won't attempt to minimize my responsibility, or to suggest that Coach Vasquez deserved what happened to her, even though in many ways she did create the conditions that led to her own death. The things I tell myself about justice don't change the fact that I deliberately killed someone. I engineered her death with precision and calculation. I need to accept that, need to acknowledge it, and need to spend the years of my imprisonment truly understanding what that means about who I am as a person." Miss Marple studied the young woman with the particular compassion she reserved for individuals capable of genuine moral reflection. "You have the capacity to emerge from this experience with your humanity intact," she said. "That capacity is something many individuals never develop. Coach Vasquez, for all her intelligence and ability, never developed it. You have. That will matter, in the long term, for who you become and how you live with what you have done." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, ranging across Sophie's early experiences as a swimmer, the moment when she first realized that her symptoms were not natural, the slow process of discovering Coach Vasquez's responsibility for her poisoning, and the gradual crystallization of her desire for revenge. By the time their discussion concluded, it was evident that Sophie had articulated for herself a clear understanding of her moral culpability, and was prepared to face whatever legal consequences would follow. As Sophie prepared to leave the observation gallery, she paused at the doorway and turned back to face Miss Marple. "Thank you for listening," she said simply. "Thank you for not treating me as simply a criminal or as a victim. Thank you for acknowledging that I'm both, and that the complexity doesn't change my responsibility." Chapter 9. The Final Analysis. Inspector Walsh completed her investigation with a comprehensive report that detailed every aspect of Coach Vasquez's criminal activities and Sophie Chen's deliberate response to those activities. The report was presented to the prosecutor's office with a clear recommendation that charges proceed on the basis of manslaughter rather than murder, acknowledging the premeditation while also acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances that had motivated the crime. The legal proceedings that followed occupied several months and generated considerable media attention. Expert witnesses testified regarding the physiological effects of the chemical substances Coach Vasquez had been employing, regarding the medical consequences that Sophie had suffered, and regarding the psychological impact of having an athletic career terminated through deliberate poisoning. The judge, in his final determination, sentenced Sophie Chen to 15 years imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 10 years, a sentence that represented neither the maximum severity nor a lenient treatment. The sentence acknowledged that Sophie had committed a serious crime, while also recognizing the extraordinary circumstances that had motivated her actions. Coach Vasquez's legacy proved considerably more complex. Her death brought an end to the systematic poisoning of competitors, yet it also revealed the extent to which such practices might have been occurring within elite synchronized swimming throughout the nation. Multiple investigations were launched into other competitive teams and coaching organizations, investigations that resulted in numerous additional charges and suspensions. The Aquatic Centre itself underwent significant changes in management and oversight, implementing new security measures and establishing protocols to prevent future exploitation of athletes. The pharmaceutical suppliers who had been enabling such criminal activities faced regulatory consequences and legal sanctions. Chapter 10. The Championship's Shadow. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead following the conclusion of the formal investigations and legal proceedings, her mind occupied with the various lessons that the Synchronized Swimming Championship had provided regarding the darker aspects of human ambition and the desire for revenge. She found herself reflecting, in the quiet hours of her return to village life, on the particular nature of the aquatic environment and how it had served as both the setting and, in many ways, the metaphor for the crime itself. Coach Vasquez had operated in the depths of her own darkness, poisoning and manipulating her competitors while maintaining a surface appearance of athletic excellence and coaching authority. Sophie Chen, motivated by the justified desire to address the wrongs committed against her, had allowed herself to be consumed by those same depths, ultimately committing an act that was as deliberately calculated as any of Vasquez's poisonings. What had struck Miss Marple most profoundly throughout her involvement in the investigation was the recognition that both women had been driven by internal compulsions that transcended moral consideration. Vasquez had been driven by the desire to achieve competitive success regardless of the harm inflicted on others. Sophie had been driven by the desire for justice and compensation, yet had been willing to pursue that justice through methods that ultimately perpetuated the cycle of violence and harm. The Aquatic Centre continued to function after the investigation concluded, albeit under new management and with substantially reformed policies. The synchronized swimming community, chastened by the revelation of systematic poisoning within its ranks, began to implement more rigorous oversight of coaching practices and competitive activities, yet the fundamental truth that the investigation had revealed remained clear. Beneath the surface of any human community, no matter how elevated or refined that community might appear, darkness could flourish, ambition could corrupt, revenge could consume, and the desire to achieve success or justice could lead individuals to commit acts they had never imagined themselves capable of performing. Sophie Chen would spend the next decade of her life in confinement, paying the price for her deliberate act of violence. The Aquatic Centre would continue to train swimmers and host competitions, yet the memory of Coach Vasquez's death would remain, a permanent reminder that even in the most beautiful and graceful of human endeavours, tragedy and malice could assert themselves with terrible finality. Miss Marple, as she settled once again into the rhythms of village life, found herself grateful for the quiet routine of St. Mary Mead, where the mysteries of human nature could be observed without the dramatic intensity that had characterized the Synchronized Swimming Championship. Yet she also recognized that the lessons she had learned through her involvement in that investigation would remain with her, informing her understanding of human behavior and the complex relationship between justice and revenge, between achieving one's goals and maintaining one's humanity in the process. The championship, that had concluded with such tragedy, ultimately served as a permanent memorial to the dangers of allowing ambition and the desire for victory to override all moral considerations. Coach Vasquez's death had been the inevitable consequence of her willingness to poison and manipulate others in pursuit of her goals, while Sophie's imprisonment was the inevitable consequence of her decision to respond to that poisoning through calculated violence rather than through the proper channels of legal redress. In the final analysis, Miss Marple reflected, the Synchronized Swimming Championship had demonstrated a truth that she had observed repeatedly throughout her life, that human nature, in all its complexity and darkness, remained fundamentally consistent regardless of the particular arena in which it expressed itself. The same desires for success, the same capacity for manipulation and revenge, the same willingness to harm others in pursuit of personal goals, all these elements existed in the respectable world of athletic competition just as surely as they existed in the quiet villages and country estates where she had previously observed them. The investigation had concluded, the guilty had been identified and prosecuted, and the Aquatic Centre had resumed its normal operations. Yet the shadow cast by Coach Vasquez's deliberate death would linger, a permanent reminder that even in the world of athletic achievement and human excellence, darkness could emerge with sudden and terrible force. This concludes our story tonight, dear listeners. Thank you for joining Connor and me here at Velvet Clues, where we explore the mysteries that human nature creates and the justice that must ultimately address them. Until next time, remain vigilant, observe carefully, and remember that the most important details are often the smallest ones.